Well, good morning. I'm glad you all have chosen to be here with us today. We're going to continue thinking on our Lenten themes that we started 3 weeks ago. We began coming from something that Lynn Swede, who's a scholar and a theologian and a preacher and he's everything. We began with something that he had posted on Facebook to say that if we are saying "I am alive," it ought to mean something. And so he was exploring what it might mean to be alive with gratitude or hope or joy or beauty or whatever it might be. Well, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about what it was like to be alive with gratitude. Last week, we talked about being alive with compassion. And we're going to continue that today with thinking about being alive with Godness, which I equate with goodness. Goodness and love come together. And then in addition to that, 2 days from now is St. Patrick's Day. And so we're going to do a little Irish thing, or we have been doing a little Irish thing here. And you notice, of course, the wearing of the green here. But it's not so much Irish as it is Celtic, that whole talk about Celtic spirituality that we've mentioned so many times here. And so we're going to explore that. Now, I'm sure that some of you here have been to Ireland, and I know I have, and there's something mystical and magical about that land, and it seems that God is very present and very evident there. And I've never quite been able to figure out exactly what it is, whether it's this incredible beauty of the countryside, if it is the warmth of the people, or if it is the fact that we live in such a busy, fast-paced world that we don't ever pay attention to all the beauty that's around us and all of the goodness that's around us at all. I was thinking back to what's happened a number of years ago now, when several of us were sitting around trying to create a picture of what we wanted gardeners, people like you, to experience as a result of being a part of the garden. And we finally came down with, we envisioned that people experience God wherever they are. Now, this was long before I had done any reading or study at all of Celtic exploration, Celtic spirituality. And when I did, I realized how very Celtic that is, the sense that God is everywhere. You see, it really is about blurring the lines between the sacred and the secular. And it's about seeing God everywhere and in everything. There is someone who said, there's not a spot where God is not. And that's really pretty much what Celtic spirituality is all about. Now, in thinking about this, it really fits in when we get in a few minutes down to the Bible passage, because it's very Celtic in thought. And the whole Celtic thinking, way of being, was something that existed long before orthodoxy and doctrine and dogma came into being. It was just a way to live faithfully. And there were many different ways to live faithfully that the church came along, the early church came along and tried to kind of stomp them out and make them less obvious. But what's come along now is that it's beginning to bubble up in other places, and people are beginning to reclaim some of those earlier ways of being and ways of thinking and ways of being a faithful person. And also, we talked about here, well, especially at Christmas time, we talked about the fact that the early church tried to reach out to people by finding ways to identify with them. They would use things that they were familiar with. We talked about winter solstice, which was considered to be a pagan holiday in time, but it was really accommodated into the church in a little different kind of way. Well, that's true of the whole thought about Celtic spirituality as well. So that's a little bit of background for our Bible passage, which is out of the book of Acts. Now, Acts is believed to have been written by Luke, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke. But yet, if you read seriously anything in Acts, you're going to find that it's mostly about the teachings and the actions of the Apostle Paul. So that's a little background to this particular passage, and this is how it reads. God isn't far away from any of us. In God, we live and move and exist. A more common way of saying that is we live and move and have our being is in God. As some of your own poets said, we are God's offspring. Well, Marcus Borg, who's a scholar, really talked about this particular passage in what I assume to be his last book, that was released right before his death not too long ago. And he talked about the fact that this passage is saying that God is not some supernatural being or some supreme parent. And he described it as more like panentheism, which is defined as everything is in God. Marcus Borg said this: "There is nowhere one can be and be outside of God, because God is everywhere." Okay, so hold that thought for a minute. And then let's think about something that Julian of Norwich, who's a 14th century Christian mystic, had to say. Because we normally say we're made by God, we're created by God, we're children of God, all of us are children of God. But Julian of Norwich said we're not just made by God, we're made of God. That means that each of us has Godness within us. Well, how do we begin to open ourselves to that Godness that is within us and all around us? How do we begin to really know what that's like and let it change us and be a part of who we are? I know one thing for sure, that I don't think it has to do with nodding our heads in agreement at some creed or of, reciting something that somebody else has said. I don't think it's that at all. I really think it's more something that, like Thomas Merton mentioned, which is the experience of presence. It's that sense of Godness, if you will, of more, of a presence, an essence that is all around us and is within us as well. Now, when we say that we're trying to experience God, I really think it's about really paying attention. It's being more aware. I use the phrase often, it's looking through a new set of eyes. It's opening our eyes in a brand new way, in a way that perhaps we've never seen before. It's a way to see Godness in a newborn baby, or to see Godness in the face of another human being. And it is about seeing. In fact, someone said spiritual practice is about remembering to see. But it's not just sitting around on the sidelines seeing. It's not a passive thing at all. It's about being and living the goodness and the love and the light of God in this world. And we do that by trying to be in harmony with the world around us. It is that part of our being where we try to be in sync with creation and in sync with one another to the greatest extent we possibly can. It is a combination of both being and doing. It is a combination of an inner awareness as well as an outer engagement. It's being a bearer of God's light and love in this world. Well, one of the writers I believe probably captures the sense of this best is Barbara Brown Taylor. And she talks about how she tries to see Godness everywhere she is. She doesn't use that term, but I'm applying it to her. And she talks about trying to have reverence toward everyone and everything, especially toward other human beings, and being reverent toward them, which is an interesting way, I think, for us to consider that. Now, she does readily admit, which I can certainly identify with, that sometimes it's easier to have reverence toward humanity in general than it is to be reverent toward a specific person or individual. And she talks, for example, about someone tailgating her in rush hour traffic, and she finds herself annoyed and not very reverent. Or someone talking really loud on a cell phone in a place that's supposed to be quiet. And again, she doesn't find herself being very reverent toward that person. But she's found, she thinks, a remedy to that. And she gives an example. She's in the grocery store, and their bag boy is crushing her portobello mushrooms. And she is terribly annoyed about it. And she is thinking about saying something that probably isn't very kind. And then she remembers, and she tries to look differently, to look with reverence. And she realizes this bad guy is a 16-year-old kid at most, probably doesn't have a clue what mushrooms are, and probably would just turn up his nose at him if he did. And she put a human face on him, and it made a difference. And she talks about all the times she tries to do that. For example, riding the subway. And especially if it's a day when she has her sunglasses on, she studies the other people around her. She really looks at them carefully and reverently. And she says as she does that, they do become human beings to her. And she realizes that we all share common struggles. We all have our burdens that we carry. And she said this. She said, paying attention to them has already shifted my equilibrium. Well, I wish I could remember more exactly who this was I was reading at one point, but someone, and it may have been Brown Taylor, actually presented this idea to me in some book that I was reading about looking up and seeing the holy wherever we are. And I remember thinking, that's an interesting thing to think about. And then I remember looking out beyond the windows of where I was and thinking, wow, it's like 3D or something. It's much more brilliant if you look at it that way. And I tried to do that. I'm not very good at it. I don't do it 24/7. I don't even do it every single day. But I try to remind myself of that, and especially when I preach to myself most of the time anyway, especially when I'm talking about something like this, try to be much more aware and much more attentive to that which is going on around us. Well, Brown Taylor again talks about how every act, even the smallest thing we do, can be holy, can be sacred, can be an act filled with godness. And she gives the example of preparing a meal for friends of hers. And she said she thinks about her love being poured out toward them because she is preparing the potatoes, peeling the potatoes, or slicing the onions. And those are holy acts, or they can become holy acts if we think of it that way. You see, it's about our bearing the light and love of God into every act, into the whole world, and of the way we see one another and look out into the world. In a very real way, I think we are God's hands and hearts and voices in this world. And that's our role. We are to be bearers of light and love. Philip Newell, in his book entitled The Rebirthing of God, tells a story about his father. He said that he and his sister had determined that his father probably needed to quit driving, that he had some confusion and that it was probably just time. And they decided that it was probably better to sell the car than to keep it and just withhold it from him. And so he called the auto dealership the day before they were going to go and made an appointment for them to go and sell this particular car. And he said to the salesman that his father was sometimes quite confused, but he wanted to be sure the salesman honored his father and talked to him and not to talk to the son. Well, the salesman got it and did precisely that. And when they had finished the whole transaction, Philip Newell said to the salesman, whenever my father and I part, he likes to give me a blessing. And I think my father would like to give you a blessing now. Is that okay? And the salesman said yes. And so at that point, the father took the salesman's hand and said, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." When he finished, tears were streaming down the salesman's face. I suspect that's a transaction he's never, ever forgotten. Philip Newell's father was a blessing. It was a blessing to that salesman. And you and I can be a blessing in this world too. I hope it will be so.